You were never supposed to hear this, but between 1847 and 1862, 37 young priests vanished from Sacred Heart Seminary, vanished without a trace. No graves, no goodbyes, no investigations, just silence and shadows. Section 1. That's how it begins. Not with thunder, not with blood, but with a silence so deliberate it's deafening. Sacred Heart wasn't just another seminary, it was a fortress. A factory designed to mold men into obedient vessels of the church. But somewhere deep beneath its hallowed halls, the blueprint changed. It stopped making priests and started feeding something else. You see, institutions don't confess. They bury. They redact. They erase. Especially when the rot starts at the top. And the rot at Sacred Heart was ancient, older than the church itself. It was imported through bloodlines and cloaked in cassocks, brought to America under the guise of salvation. But this story doesn't begin with saints. It begins with 3 men who weren't priests at all, criminals masquerading in the robes of righteousness. Men who crossed the Atlantic with forged documents, Irish charm, and a hunger not for holiness but for power. And behind them, a secret syndicate hidden inside the Vatican itself, watching, funding, pulling strings. The church needed American priests. The immigrants needed shepherds. But these men saw something else. They saw land, gold, and bodies, young, able-bodied men who could be sold, bartered, or buried depending on the needs of the day. Sacred Heart became a butcher shop with stained glass windows. 37 sons. Gone. One by one. Parents were told their boys had been sent to missions in Iowa, Nebraska, Mexico. That they had died bravely of fever. That they had succumbed to divine callings in far-off villages no one could verify. But the truth was darker. Some were trafficked. Some were experimented on. Some were simply erased. And the Vatican? Silent. They sealed the records, buried the ledgers, and sent warnings to any cleric who dared ask questions. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't erase, was the evidence hidden under the chapel's floorboards. Correspondence, maps, orders signed in blood. You were never supposed to know this. But now that you do, there's no going back. You're being invited into a darker truth, one that will strip the varnish from every cathedral and show you what's been hiding behind the pulpits. Because Sacred Heart wasn't sacred at all. Section 2. They called him Father Walsh. But his name wasn't Walsh, not legally, not spiritually, not even historically. It was an identity fabricated with precision, forged in the blackened corridors of a Dublin prison. His real name has been lost to time, but fragments remain in Irish court records. A tall man, fluent in 5 languages, convicted of fraud, and vanished from custody in 1845. 2 years later, he appeared in Illinois with ecclesiastical credentials no one dared question. That was his first trick. He didn't hide in the shadows. He stood in the light, preached in the chapel, sat at the head of every meal. He didn't evade authority, he became it. Because the greatest manipulators don't rebel against systems, they wear their uniforms. Alongside him, Father Murphy and Dean O'Brien. Also aliases, also lies. Together, these 3 men established the seminary's doctrine, policies, and psychological structure. They weren't just running a school, they were crafting a belief system. One designed not to inspire, but to control. Control minds. Control movement. Control memory. Let me ask you this. What kind of man arrives in a new country and instantly rises to the top of a religious institution without any background checks? No seminary transcript verification, no diocesan oversight? Answer: the kind backed by powerful forces who benefit from keeping truth obscured. The seminary's funding came from donations, but financial ledgers recovered in 1983 before they were seized by Vatican emissaries revealed something else. There were payments from shipping companies, from aristocratic European families, even from political intermediaries linked to southern slave markets. What were they funding? Young seminarians were listed on back pages under coded terms: lambs, assets, field ready. Some entries were marked with a red cross, presumed dead. Others with a black circle, transferred, location unknown. This wasn't spiritual formation. It was a marketplace. But what makes this all so insidious is how it was veiled behind scripture. These boys were taught to obey without question, to see suffering as sanctification, to believe that hardship was the fire through which holiness is forged. So when they were isolated, starved, beaten, and vanished, it was seen as divine mystery, not demonic crime. This is the face of psychological control when the abused believe their abuse is sacred. The question isn't just how they got away with it. The question is, who helped them? Who stood behind the pulpit and gave these monsters their masks? And what deeper force was pulling all their strings? Section 3. The town of Millfield, Illinois, 15 miles from the seminary gates, was built on two things: corn and obedience. A sleepy grid of wooden storefronts, a general store, a blacksmith, and a single dirt road lined with homes that all looked the same. But its soul that belonged to Sacred Heart. Every economy needs a pillar. For Millfield, the seminary was everything: jobs, commerce, status. And so the townsfolk asked no questions. Not when shipments came in after midnight. Not when students were never seen again. Not even when coffins left the grounds under heavy guard and were buried without names. You see, silence isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's survival. The seminary hired only local laborers, men paid in cash, sworn to secrecy, often threatened with excommunication if they spoke. But rumors spread like mildew. Parents spoke of phantom wagons that came from the woods, not the road. Children whispered about the stone house under the hill, where lights glowed at odd hours. And inside Sacred Heart, something darker was happening, not just to the body, but to the mind. Every incoming seminarian was put through a ritual of silence, 40 days of fasting, penance, and isolation. They were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Eye contact with superiors was punishable. Sleep was broken every 3 hours for disciplinary prayer. This wasn't theology. It was conditioning. Some called it spiritual purification. But if you understand psychological warfare, you know exactly what it was: trauma-based compliance. The curriculum wasn't designed to illuminate faith, it was built to fragment identity. The texts chosen weren't just Catholic doctrine, but obscure medieval grimoires repurposed under Latin names. De Obedientia Perfecta, a manual on total submission. Dominium Mentis, mind control, disguised as mystical contemplation. And most disturbing, a handwritten volume, Codex Voritas, translated as the Green Code, filled with diagrams of the human brain, alchemical symbols, and prayers written backward. One page bore only a single sentence over and over again: break the will, and the soul follows. Let that settle. They weren't preparing priests. They were manufacturing vessels. Empty, obedient, erased. And those who resisted, those who questioned, hesitated, disobeyed, they didn't graduate. They disappeared. 37 names. 37 silent screams buried beneath candle wax and ritual. Millfield pretended it didn't happen. But the earth remembers. And it's time you remember too. Section 4. You want to know how deep this really goes? Let me show you the architecture. Sacred Heart wasn't just designed for worship. It was designed for containment. Beneath the main chapel, hidden behind the altar, was a stairwell no student was ever allowed to enter. It descended into what was officially called the scriptorium, a space reserved for the preservation of sacred texts. But those who worked the grounds called it something else. The underneath. It was cold down there, too cold for Illinois in spring. Former maintenance workers, those few still alive, reported stone walls thick with condensation, doors reinforced with iron, and a labyrinth of candlelit corridors that didn't match the blueprints submitted to the diocese. There were chambers within chambers, dead ends, sealed rooms. One man, Jacob Ely, groundskeeper for 11 years, described it as a place where sound doesn't come back. That's not architecture. That's engineering. But here's the most damning part. None of it shows up on official church records. Not one mention in the original construction permits. Not one reference in the diocesan reports. Not even a financial trail for the materials. That's how you know it was real. Because the deepest secrets don't hide behind what's said, they hide behind what's missing. And then, there were the bells. Every night at precisely 3:17 a.m., the chapel bell would ring once. Just once. too soft to wake the town, but loud enough for every seminarian to hear it through stone walls. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't mechanical. It was ritual. Some called it the third hour, a perversion of the traditional time of Christ's death. But others believed it was a summoning, that each toll signaled another departure, another student taken, another soul consumed by whatever force fed the rot beneath Sacred Heart. In Joseph Kennedy's hidden journals smuggled out in 1863 and rediscovered a century later, he wrote of hearing footsteps outside his dormitory door exactly 5 minutes after each bell strike. Always soft, always measured, and always ending with a door creaking open and never closing. That's not a schedule. That's a harvest. And if you think this is just historical curiosity, let me ask you, why does the Vatican still send 2 security agents every year to inspect an abandoned seminary that hasn't hosted students in 150 years? Because Sacred Heart didn't close. It was sealed. Section 5. There's something you need to understand about institutions like the Church. They never destroy evidence. They just hide it under layers of holiness, protocol, and bureaucracy so thick that most men lose themselves before ever reaching the truth. But one man didn't. His name was Father Elias Monroe, a Jesuit, a scholar, and a Vatican-trained historian sent to Sacred Heart in 1902 to conduct what was officially called an archival preservation review. Unofficially, he was a cleaner, a man who made secrets disappear. But Monroe didn't vanish the past. He uncovered it. You see, Monroe was different. Raised in an orphanage run by nuns in Marseille, he had been beaten, starved, and broken before the age of 10. But instead of submitting, he watched. He memorized. He learned their codes, their silences, their rituals. By the time the Vatican brought him in, he knew how darkness dressed itself in light. And what he found in Sacred Heart changed him forever. He was there for 6 weeks. 6 sleepless weeks inside walls that whispered and floors that moaned. He catalogued over 400 banned texts, 17 of which had been officially outlawed by papal decree in the 16th century. He found diagrams, drawings of human anatomy blended with religious iconography. Faces with no eyes, mouths sewn shut, altars not meant for worship, but dissection. And buried beneath the floorboards of the dean's quarters, he found the Black Ledger. A leather-bound book, wrapped in red cloth and sealed with wax that bore no ecclesiastical crest, only a serpent devouring its own tail. Inside, names, dates, symbols, a ledger of transactions. But these weren't monetary. They were sacrificial. Next to each name, one of the 37 vanished students was a corresponding code and a Latin phrase. Oblatio corporalis pro auctoritate, a bodily offering for authority. What kind of priest keeps a record of human offerings? The answer is simple. Not a priest. Monroe fled the seminary the night he found the ledger. He never returned. He disappeared from public life, stripped of his title, labeled insane. But in a final letter to his brother smuggled from a French asylum and postmarked in 1905, he wrote 6 chilling words. They fed something, and it answered. This wasn't just corruption. It was communion with something that wasn't God. Section 6. Most men fear what they can see: guns, knives, angry mobs. But the deadliest power in this world doesn't raise its voice. It signs documents. It approves transfers. It seals archives. And that's exactly how Sacred Heart survived. You see, when Father Monroe vanished, the Vatican issued no investigation. No statement. No mourning. They simply replaced him with another archivist, one who never wrote a single report. That's how institutional manipulation works. It doesn't erase truth. It buries it under so much protocol that the digging feels like heresy. But sometimes something slips. In 1934, during renovations to the Vatican's secret archives, a young clerk named Matteo Lozado accidentally opened a misfiled box marked Apostolic Decree Illinois. There is no such decree. There is no such province. And yet, inside were 67 documents, most of them in code detailing ritual reassignments, doctrinal reconditioning, and pre-sanctified offerings. One memo, signed only by an initial A, contained these words: "The experiment must continue. The harvest is not yet complete." Matteo tried to bring the documents forward. He was found dead 2 weeks later. Accidental drowning. In a locked room. No water. His wife said he had nightmares for days before it happened, visions of red candles and masked men chanting in Latin. She recalled the final phrase he mumbled in his sleep. The altar is a door. Now listen closely. The deeper you go into the Sacred Heart archives, the more the language shifts. It stops being about education and starts being about possession. Possession of what? Not property. Not even people. Souls. There are transcripts of private confessions stolen and archived where students begged for release from the voices beneath the floor, claimed they were being watched from the crucifix, and described dreams in which their own faces were carved away and replaced with masks. And still the bishops signed off. Still the money flowed. Still the disappearances continued. You must ask yourself, how many good men were sacrificed so an invisible force could wear the church like a costume? How many sons went to Sacred Heart to serve God and were instead fed to something older, hungrier, and far more calculating? This is what forbidden history looks like. Not dusty parchment, but blood. Signed in silence. Section 7. By the 1940s, Sacred Heart had become a fortress of prestige. It produced bishops, scholars, even political advisors. Its corridors were polished, its grounds immaculate, and its choir world-renowned. But beneath that heavenly music was a pulse. A slow, deliberate beat. One that didn't stop. Not when 19-year-old Thomas Keegan went missing from his theology dorm. Not when Brother Alonzo confessed sobbing to hearing voices in the chapel calling his name in reverse. Not even when a student named Daniel Royce was found in the bell tower with his own eyes sewn shut and the words per viam sanguinis carved into his chest. Through blood the way. And still, the administration called them isolated tragedies, accidents, mental breakdowns. But there was a problem. The same phrases, the same symbols, the same rituals kept resurfacing, always connected to those who vanished or died. And all of it linked to what insiders began calling the 13th room. No records of it exist in the seminary's floor plans. No students were ever officially assigned to it. And yet every janitor, every groundskeeper, every night watchman knew about it. A locked chamber beneath the old library. Bricked over in 1951 after a fire no one ever reported. But according to one surviving groundskeeper, an old man named Ezekiel Hart, who died in 1983, what was sealed inside wasn't books. It was a chair. Not an ordinary one. Iron-bound. Encircled with carvings. Facing a mirror that reflected nothing. Hart claimed he once peered through the cracks in the wall and saw a figure sitting in that chair. But not a person. He said it looked like a man wearing priest's robes made of shadows. No face. No skin. Just presence. It stared into the mirror for hours. Days. Weeks, and every time it did, another student vanished. Hart's last words before he died? They didn't build the seminary to serve God. They built it to feed him. So ask yourself, how do you hide a ritual? You don't. You fund it. You normalize it. You call it tradition. And by the time anyone realizes what they've witnessed, they're too deep to leave. Section 8. In 1947, a new seminary rector arrived at Sacred Heart. Father Lucian Barrett. Publicly, he was hailed as a reformer, charming, eloquent, a man of the people. But those who served under him whispered something different. He didn't blink. Ever. They said his voice would change pitch without warning, sometimes mid-sentence. They said birds refused to land near his window. That mirrors in his office turned black on certain nights. And he had one obsession. The Chapel of the Veil. It was a small, rarely used prayer room at the back of the seminary. Most didn't even know it existed. But Barrett ordered it restored lavishly. Gold-plated altar, velvet drapes, and a large mosaic depicting the binding of Isaac. Only, something was off. In the mosaic, the angel who stops Abraham isn't holding back his hand. It's guiding it. And behind Isaac there's a second boy. Faceless, bound, bleeding from the eyes. This was no act of mercy. This was a blueprint. Rector Barrett began holding midnight reflection ceremonies in that chapel. No students allowed. No records kept. Only 12 men ever attended one for each apostle, they said. 7 of those men would vanish within the next 3 years. No funerals, no farewells, just erased. But one survived. A former deacon named Elijah Moore. He escaped Sacred Heart in 1951, fled to Mexico, and lived under a new name until his death in 1994. Before he died, he gave a sworn testimony to a journalist unpublished until recently. He said the Chapel of the Veil was not for prayer. It was a threshold. He described candles that flickered in unnatural patterns, walls that breathed, and voices that whispered from the blood-soaked tiles. The purpose of the ceremonies? To open something, not metaphorically, literally. A door, a gate, an altar turned inside out. He claimed the priests weren't offering prayers. They were offering selves, piece by piece. Moore's final words were written, not spoken. 4 chilling syllables. I saw it wake. That chapel was sealed in 1952, but the foundation still hums. So again, how many priests disappeared from Sacred Heart? 37 is just the number we know. What about the others, the ones who were rewritten, not removed? The ones who didn't die but changed? Section 9. In 1953, the Vatican quietly dispatched a delegation to Sacred Heart Seminary. Officially, it was a routine audit. Unofficially, it was damage control. 3 cardinals. 4 bishops. 1 Jesuit historian. They stayed for 11 days. On the 12th, the entire delegation vanished on their return trip, plane wreckage never found. No media coverage. No official report. Only a single telegram intercepted decades later by declassified intelligence files. It read, "The threshold is active. The mirror pulses. Terminate chapel operations immediately." Seal 13. It was signed with a code name, Dominus Iudex. The response from the Church? Silence. Sacred Heart continued operating business as usual. New staff, new students, new rules. But something was missing, or rather, something had changed. One survivor of the seminary from that era, Father James Rowe, recounted his final days before fleeing to Argentina under false papers. He said the air in the chapel had become thick like syrup, but metallic, that prayers no longer felt like they rose but sank. He claimed the sermons began to take on a hypnotic rhythm, repetitive, monotonous, almost coded. Worse, he described the mirroring ritual. Students selected at random were brought before a tall, blackened mirror said to reside in the catacombs beneath the chapel. They were instructed to look in silence for exactly 13 minutes. Most emerged changed, silent, emotionless, but some didn't emerge at all. One student, Paul Henriksen, was reportedly heard screaming behind the sealed door. But when it was opened, only his clothes remained, folded neatly on the floor. No blood, no sign of struggle, just the faint scent of myrrh and sulfur. And what did Rector Barrett say about all this? He claimed it was part of the sacred refinement process, a test of devotion, a necessary pruning. But let me ask you something. Who tests the testers? Who holds them accountable? And if the institution tasked with guiding souls begins to barter them instead? What's left? A building? A brand? Or a machine? A machine that feeds on faith and never stops. Section 10. By 1956, Sacred Heart Seminary was no longer a place of formation. It was a crucible. Students were no longer chosen for intellect, discipline, or devotion. They were chosen for suggestibility. One former seminarian, Thomas Clemens, later diagnosed with severe dissociative disorder, claimed his final year at Sacred Heart was nothing but a waking trance. He described waking up in different rooms with no memory of how he got there. He said lectures began including non-language segments, chants or syllables that sounded like Latin, but weren't. They vibrated through the spine, induced nausea, induced compliance. In his words, they were trying to hollow us out, carve us like vessels, to make room for them. Who is them? That brings us to the most disturbing layer. Records obtained from a defrocked cleric's personal archive revealed that Sacred Heart had established communication with an unknown entity or intelligence, referred to in internal documents as the Echo. Not a person, Not a demon, but something ancient, something that answered only in dreams. The echo would appear as the last person the dreamer loved, but with empty eyes, and it would always say the same thing. Let me in. I remember your name. When asked what the echo wanted, survivors gave hauntingly similar answers. It wants form. And how does it get form? Through ritual, through sacrifice, through mirroring. The same black mirror once used for spiritual reflection had become a gate of invocation not for God, but for something far older. The chapel's foundation wasn't holy ground. It was a beacon, and by 1957 it was humming louder than ever. 17 more students went missing that year. All of them were marked by the same thing. A tiny brand behind the right ear. A symbol never explained. A symbol not of the church but of something else. So here's the question. If Sacred Heart was no longer training priests, what was it training them for? And who or what was truly behind the pulpit? Section 11. Let me pull back the veil on what that symbol means. The tiny brand behind the ear, no bigger than a pinhead, was the ancient mark of Acheron. Not found in any holy scripture. Not mentioned in any sanctioned theology. Acheron, the river of woe in the underworld, a gateway between worlds. To carry its mark is to bear a contract, a binding pact with forces beyond mortal understanding. And here's the chilling truth. The brand wasn't a punishment. It was a promise. A promise that the marked were no longer their own men, their souls sold. But to whom? Documents uncovered in the private collection of Bishop Gregory Thurston, a man whose mysterious death was ruled a suicide in 1963, hint at a shadow council. A clandestine group known only as the Custodians. The Custodians are believed to be a cabal within the church hierarchy that preserved forbidden rites dating back to pre-Christian times, blending pagan ritual with Christian ceremony to maintain control over the flock. Their power derived not from faith, but from manipulation, from fear, from control. They orchestrated the disappearances. They controlled the harvest. They fed the hunger beneath. And they did it under the guise of divine will. But what's most disturbing is how far their reach extended. One decrypted letter from 1959, addressed to an unknown cardinal, reveals plans to replicate Sacred Heart's protocols in other seminaries across the United States. It was a blueprint for institutional domination through psychological control and occult ritual. Sacred Heart wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype, an experiment in human obedience and spiritual subjugation. And for nearly a century it operated in plain sight. Because when men in power blend religion with ancient darkness, the truth becomes the deadliest weapon, and the silence becomes a prison. Section 12. If you're still with me, understand this. This isn't just history. This is a map, a guidebook for how institutions bend men's minds and souls to their will. The psychological control at Sacred Heart was so sophisticated that many victims never realized they were trapped until it was too late. It began with isolation, a centuries-old tool. Cut off from family. Forbidden contact with the outside world. Letters censored. Visitors denied. Then, a daily regimen of rituals designed to erode individuality. Prayers that looped in hypnotic cadence. Confessions stripped of confidentiality. Ceremonies that blurred reality with the supernatural. Layered on top was a curriculum engineered to confuse and fracture the mind. Theological concepts twisted into paradoxes. Moral absolutes replaced with shifting rules. Language weaponized to induce obedience. But the true control came from the secret chambers beneath the seminary, those forbidden spaces where the real rites occurred. Men were subjected to sensory deprivation and overwhelming stimuli, alternating like waves designed to drown and awaken simultaneously. Those who resisted were broken. Those who complied were transformed. One survivor described his experience as being carved out like a statue, hollowed, then filled with shadows that whispered promises of power. Power, that's the catch. Power as the ultimate carrot and stick. The promise of spiritual enlightenment, leadership, and secret knowledge. A promise so intoxicating that few could resist. But here's what they never tell you. The deeper you go into that power, the less of you remains. You become a vessel, a tool, a ghost trapped in a machine. And Sacred Heart? It was the crucible that forged these ghosts, made them obedient, made them disappear. But this is only the beginning, because if the seminary was the forge, then the church itself was the anvil. Section 13. Think about it. A sacred institution meant to guide souls toward light becomes a factory of shadows. Sacred Heart Seminary was not an outlier. It was a cornerstone in a vast network designed to suppress the truth, manipulate belief, and maintain a hidden power structure that reaches far beyond those Illinois prairies. When men enter seeking purpose and leave as hollow shells, where do their broken fragments go? Into the hands of those who crave control, political, financial, spiritual. This is not a story about a handful of missing priests. It's a story about how power corrupts the very fabric of faith and turns sanctity into servitude. Over the decades, the Church's outward face has been one of sanctimony and grace. But behind that facade lies a machinery of psychological warfare rituals designed not to free souls but to bind them tighter. The same forces that once manipulated Sacred Heart students now weave their influence through seminaries, parishes, and councils worldwide. How many decisions that shape nations have been influenced by those forged in darkness? How many doctrines whispered in secret chambers have steered millions down paths of unquestioning obedience? These are questions that few dare to ask. And the silence? That is the deadliest weapon. Because silence protects predators. Silence protects secrets. Silence preserves power. But you are here now. You have heard what others never dared to speak. And with knowledge comes responsibility. To awaken, to question, to pierce the veil. The battle for your soul is not just spiritual, it is psychological, institutional, and ancient. Those who disappeared from Sacred Heart were not just victims. They were casualties of a war fought in shadows. Now, before we descend deeper, I want you to do something. In the comments below, type the phrase, "I walk the path of shadows" twice. This is not a game. It is a commitment, a seal of your transformation, a signal to the forces that you are awake. Because once you see the machinery behind the curtain, you cannot unsee it. You are marked now, and the journey has only just begun. Section 14. Now let me show you what they feared most. Exposure. In 1977, a janitor named Elias Drew, just a maintenance worker, discovered a sealed storage room behind the seminary's East Wing boiler house. Inside were over 200 reel-to-reel tapes, marked only with dates and initials. He didn't know what he had found, but he knew enough to run. One of those tapes later leaked anonymously contained a chilling recording of what experts now believe was a midnight initiation ritual. The voices? Recognizable. High-ranking church officials, priests, even one cardinal. They chanted in Latin but not scripture. It was twisted, fragmented, like someone had tried to hide meaning behind code. Audio forensics uncovered backwards messages layered underneath the chants. Phrases like, "From death, life. We offer the vessel. Open the mouth, bind the will." Then came the screaming. A man's voice, young, terrified, pleading in English. "Please, not again. I'll do anything. Just let me go." Then silence, static, and laughter. That tape vanished soon after circulating in underground truth-seeker forums in the early 2000s. Every attempt to track its origin ended in dead ends, dead links, or more disturbingly dead people. Elias Drew, killed in a hit-and-run 2 months later. No witnesses, no suspects. A journalist who picked up the story in 1984, found hanged in his home, ruled a suicide, but no note, and hands bound behind his back. And a bishop named Corbin Yule, who tried to launch an internal investigation. Heart attack, in his sleep, at 49. See the pattern? Anyone who gets too close to the truth either vanishes or dies. And yet, the church remained untouched. Why? Because power protects itself. Because the world runs on systems, and those systems are built on the bones of the silent. And because darkness doesn't fear the light, it feeds on it. Section 15, the final chapter, the price of knowing. So now we arrive at the edge. The veil is torn, the names whispered, the signs revealed. You've walked with me through the long corridors of Sacred Heart Seminary, past the sealed rooms, the missing priests, the tapes soaked in torment. And now you understand. This was never about faith. This was about control. Control so old, so embedded, that it wears the face of holiness while hiding a heart of rot. From ancient rites disguised as tradition to powerful men cloaked in robes who answer not to God but to an invisible council of silence. What they practiced inside Sacred Heart wasn't just indoctrination. It was transformation. They didn't just break minds. They reprogrammed them. These 37 missing priests, they weren't random. They were the ones who resisted, the ones who saw too much, asked the wrong questions, refused to participate in the rituals that twisted scripture into something else, something older than Christianity, something darker than heresy. And when they vanished, the official church said nothing. Because in the war between obedience and truth is the first casualty. But now you know. You see it, don't you? This isn't just about one seminary. It's about a system that spans countries, decades, and generations. A machinery of obedience, fueled by guilt, shame, ritual, and fear. And if you're still watching, you've passed the point of no return. You're not like them. You were never meant to follow blindly. You were meant to awaken. So what now? You have two choices. 1. Forget. Pretend this was just another internet horror story. Go back to your routine. Let the shadows reclaim your mind. 2. Or become a seeker. Question what you've been told. Dig. Connect the dots. Spread the truth. If you choose the second path, comment below. The blood of silence will not cover the truth. Let them know you're not afraid. Let them know their time in the dark is ending. Because secrets rot in the light. And now, the light is you.